Professor Vandell is the chair of the Department of Education here at the University of California, Irvine. Before joining the UC Irvine faculty, she was the Sears Bascom Professor of Education at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she held appointments in educational psychology, human development and family studies, and psychology. The author of more than 150 articles and 3 books, Professor Vandell studies the effects of developmental context on children's social and academic skills. Professor Vandell has served on advisory boards for the National Academy of Science, the National Institutes of Health, the U.S. Department of Education, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, W.T. Grant Foundation, and the National Institute for Early Education Research. Her testimony before the U.S. Congress and other federal, state, and local governmental bodies has been used to inform policy decisions in early childhood, after-school programming, and K-12 education. Professor Vandell received the Faculty Distinguished Achievement Award from the School of Education at the University of Wisconsin and the Distinguished Teaching Award from the University of Texas at Dallas. She is also a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the American Psychological Society, and the American Educational Research Association. Today, she will be sharing her research on the relations between early child care and adolescent functioning based on results from the NICHD Study of Early Child Care and Youth Development. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Deborah Lowe.
Thank you, Sabrina. My mom used to say that she could hear my voice on the playground when she would come pick me up across the school ground. So I am presuming that the folks on the back row can hear me just fine, since this is a smaller room than a playground. I'm going to be talking today about some of the most recent results from the NICHD Study of Early Child Care and Youth Development. The research was created or grew out of 2 long-standing and conflicting perspectives. On the one hand, there have been beliefs and research evidence for a long time about the positive effects of child care, of early education. And we see, for example, a number of intervention studies, particularly with economically disadvantaged children, the Abecedarian, the Perry Preschool, the Chicago Child Parent Centers, among others, that have talked about and have documented some positive effects associated with attending high-quality programming. We also have a long history, really starting since the 1920s and 30s, of nursery schools for middle-class children, where families believe that their children are benefiting from attending centers with other children, and that those centers are promoting their cognitive and academic achievement. At the same time, there's another view, and that is that early child care represents a risk for young children, and that attending early child care will lead to greater problem behaviors. Part of this perspective really comes out of attachment theory and the evidence from children who were institutionalized in early childhood orphanage children, where they were finding that separations from the mother over time are related to problem behaviors. These 2 long-standing sets of beliefs and conflicting perspectives came to a head what would now be back maybe the mid-80s, and where there were a number of debates where Professor Jay Belsky on the one side and others, Allison Clark-Stewart here at UCI, Kathleen McCartney, Deborah Phillips, were talking about the role of the positive benefits of early child care. It really led to what some called the Daycare Wars. And in 1988, when things were getting very heated, Dr. Dwayne Alexander, who was the director of the NICHD, convened a summit to resolve the controversy. So researchers from around the country, around the world, were brought together for this summit, And the summit concluded with that research was not at that time available to resolve this controversy. That the existing research in 1988, that there were few controls for family characteristics, so the issue could be explained by family characteristics that were leading children to different types of care. It could be also that there were small samples, so there were great worries about how generalizable the findings were. Most of the studies at that point had focused either on child care quality or amount of time in child care or type of care, center care versus family care, relative care. And it was not possible to see if maybe some of the differences in findings were because different aspects of care were being measured. It was also the case that studies were focusing either on social outcomes or cognitive outcomes. And finally, there were no studies of long-term effects of routine care. At that point, there were beginning to be some of the longer-term studies of the Abecedarian or the Perry Preschool Project that were taking effects up to middle school and early high school at that point. But there were no long-term effects, particularly of routine care. So Dr. Alexander, at the advice that occurred during this summit, said this is a public health issue. We need to know if early child care works as a support for early development, or if early child care represents a risk for development, or under what circumstances do these hold. So NICHD had a competition, and researchers around the country wrote proposals of how they thought one might go about addressing these issues around the daycare wars. What kinds of data could we collect to start to inform this issue? In the end, in 1989, NICHD funded 10 sites to conduct a large-scale study. It was a non-experimental study that was going to be following children and families in the U.S. who were using the care that the families might be selecting over time. When the study started, the value and importance of experimental studies in the context of early child care was not as recognized as it is now. But I think that what the NICHD study did, as we were conceptualizing it, was taking some 1,300 children, following them in the types of care that they were engaging in, the hours that the family might be doing, observing the children in care, and also collecting extensive information about their families, with this question of saying, is early child care, is that predicting positive social and cognitive development, physical development, or is it representing negatives in either social, cognitive, or physical development? The study has been now, has occurred in, well, actually when we signed on to do the study in phase 1, it was to take us to age 3. So the investigators started coming together in 1989. Initially, we went to DC every month. We spent 3 days every month designing the study. After about 6 years, we cut back to, instead of going to DC every month, we went every other month. And we did that for the next 20 years. It was an enormous investment of us designing a study. So there's a steering committee. It was truly a collaboration. In phase 1, when we signed on, we thought we were signing on only to phase 1. And then we recompeted for phase 2. So phase 1 took us to age 3. Phase 2 took us up to first grade. Phase 3 took us through 6th grade. Phase 4 took us to age 15. And today is a really, I'm going to get goosebumps as I say. Today we, or Sunday, yesterday, we completed data collection for phase 5, which gets us to the high school graduation. And we are at phase 5. I have goosebumps as well. At phase 5, we had 82% participation rate at phase 5 from phase 4. We are still up at about 900 children in the study. So, but in phase 1, when we started the project, we were at 1,364 children. When the sample was established, or when the study was conceptualized, NICHD had a competition. People wrote grants about what they thought would be a good study. Then they were reviewed by peer reviewers, and 10 sites, 10 investigators and investigative teams were funded. And if you look up on the screen here, you'll see where those 10 sites were. Happens that UC Irvine was one of those 10 sites. I see Wendy Goldberg over here, who was one of the investigators from the UC Irvine site. University with Andrea Karsh was the site coordinator for the Irvine site. I was at the if you look up there in the Midwest, I was at the University of Wisconsin. Then you'll see what the other sites were. It was not drawn as a nationally representative sample. It was done by, the sites were selected because they had the highest priority scores on the peer review process. So it was pure luck that if you look at the demographic characteristics of the sample at recruitment, that the sample was remarkably similar to the characteristics of the U.S. at that time in terms of percent in poverty, for example, maternal education, the proportion of two-parent households. The area, one of the places that has really changed, I think in the U.S. since the 20 years ago when this sample was recruited, is if you look at the proportion Hispanic, that proportion is much smaller now, or is much smaller than what one would be seeing in the U.S. if we were doing the recruitment today. I think it's an interesting, and it was, however, pretty similar to what you saw at the U.S. at that time, even though it wasn't drawn to be a nationally representative sample. One of the areas that we spent a lot of time as we designed the project was on the conceptualization of childcare. And in the conception, so one of the things that the way we've designed is we're getting together every month, the investigators. We sat around a big table. And one investigator would stand up and say, here's how I think we should measure this. Here's how I think we should measure that. And people would then vet it. Typically, we were very concerned always about the reliability and the validity of the measures. One of the real problems was at that point, we didn't have a roadmap to guide us for many of these. So we tended to say, measuring childcare one time is probably not going to do it. How often do we need to do collect some of these measures? So here's what we did for childcare hours. We did phone interviews every 3 months, 3 to 4 months, and we asked the mom to report up to 3 types of care they were using, the hours that they were using the care. And so when I'm going to be talking about hours of care as we go forward in the talk today, these are going to be hours collected every 3 months through the first 4.5 years. Then we also were interested in type of care. And in many of the analyses over time, we started featuring and talking about center type care. But we actually, in the context of the study, were measuring father care, grandparent care, child care homes, which is another thing for family daycare, center type care, as well as nannies. In some of our original work, we've juxtaposed mother care versus some of these other types of care. And that really came out of the zeitgeist of the time of what was child care going to be doing to the attachment relationship, what was going to be happening to children's development when they were separated from the mother. And then what I think was one of our big contributions was that we were doing observations of child care quality. most of the, well, all of the existing measures to that time were measures that were developed for particular settings. So the ECRS, an early childhood rating system, was available when we were doing this work, but it was work for center type care. We were going to be looking at nannies, grandmothers, grandfathers, fathers. So we knew that something that was centric, that wasn't going to be what we should be doing. So we were looking for a measure that was going to be that we could be using across settings. And so in designing the measure of early child care, it was a measure we call the ORS, the Observational Record of the Caregiving Environment. The ORS was focusing on the target child, the study child, and what kinds of experiences was the study child having in the child care settings. We had some considerable debates. Should we be rating the quality of care using qualitative ratings, or should we be using a time sample, ticking off behaviors that we thought were either markers of high quality or poor quality? We talked about it a lot, and in what we decided to do was to do both. And usually in this study, if we had a big debate with some people saying, no, the way to do it is this way, and other people saying, no, the way to do it is this way based on the evidence, we typically did it both ways. And so today I'm going to be talking about analyses from the qualitative ratings, but there are other analyses that are parallel to these that could be using more the time sample ratings. It turned out that the two approaches were correlated about 0.7. So they're related to one another. But when you're starting a study and you're thinking that the work that you're doing is addressing an important public health issue, you don't want to look back later and go, well, gee, we should have done it differently, which was a big worry at the time. Okay, so this is giving us some of the distributions of child care quality, hours, and center type. If you look at some of the earlier reports from the study, these figures are going to look a little different than what will come in the earlier reports. Because what I'm going to be talking about today are effects of non-familial care. That is, center type, nanny, child care homes. Over time, we found that the effects related to father care and mother care was not, we didn't get any different effects. We also started looking at grandparent care early on. We didn't really find different effects here. So we're going to be focusing here really on non-familial care. And so some of these distributions may look a little different than some of the other work and some of our earlier work. So if you look over on quality, you're going to be seeing that about 38% of the care that we looked at was what we would be calling poor quality using the ORCE. About 17% would be what you'd be calling high quality on the observational record. If you're looking at hours, you're going to be seeing that about 45% of the children were in care for less than 10 hours a week across the first 4.5 years. About 9 or 10% were going to be in care for more than 40 hours a week across the first 4.5 years. And in terms of center care, you're going to be seeing that I think about 60% of the children had some center care by the time they got to 4.5, with less than 20% being in center care for more than a year. Okay, one of the big reasons that we had the study was this question about, is early child care going to have a detrimental effect on the mother-child attachment relationship? And this is not the purpose of my study today, but I thought I'd give you one slide about the effects of early child care on attachment. Here we looked at attachment security at 15 months using the Ainsworth Strange situation. We looked again at attachment at 36 months, also using a modified attachment. We also did it at 24 months. Again, we had debates around the table. Should we measure attachment this way or this way or this way? And so if in doubt, we did it both ways, or all three ways. What we found was that attachment security, quality of the child's attachment to the mother, was not related to either child care quality, amount of care, age of entry into care, stability of care at either 15 months or 36 months. What we did find was some evidence that poor quality child care exacerbated the negative effects of poor quality mothering in terms of attachment. So the biggest predictor of attachment quality to mother was quality of the mother's behavior. And if the quality of the mother's behavior was insensitive, intrusive, detached, that in combination with poor quality care also further upped the incidence of insecure attachment relationships. One slide aside, you know, Greg sitting up here in the front row, it's always dangerous to talk when an economist is in the room. But Greg has had a front page above the full New York Times story on some of his work a couple of years ago. The attachment findings were our front page above the full New York Times story. It was a big study when it came out that attachment was not related, because people were really expecting separations from the mother to disrupt the attachment relationship. Okay. Also, we have a number of other studies, or a number of studies and findings that let me describe a little bit before we move on to the findings for today. In a series of papers, we looked at the effects of child care quality, hours, and types on social outcomes and cognitive outcomes. So here's a summary across several papers and several presentations of looking at effects associated with child care quality. What we find is that at 54 months, that'll be the gold bar. At grade 1, that would be the light blue, and grade 3, that'll be the darker blue. We find some associations between child care quality, measured using this observational measure of quality that we have, that we did our observations of child care quality at 6 months, 15 months, 24, 36, 54 months. We would go in and do 2 days of observation, assessing the quality of the care. Some of the graduate students here, we're going to be talking about some of those observations on Wednesday, when they're going to be doing some quality ratings on the ORS with some of these age periods. So what we see is controlling for a variety of family factors. We'll look at them more in a few minutes. We find that quality of child care was related to applied problems, which is the Woodcock-Johnson measure that looks at math skills. We find that quality of care was also related to picture vocabulary, and we find that it was related to children's memory on a digit span task that's also Woodcock-Johnson. Now, all of these effects are small effects. What is sort of interesting, I think, when we had the 54-month findings, given how small the effects were, the most likely thing you might think would happen is that the effects were small at 54 months. They should fade away by the time kids go to first grade. They should fade away by the time kids go to third grade. And what was a bit of a surprise to us is that the effects, small that they were, stayed there just about the same size that they were at 54 months. We also looked at, in some of these earlier reports, effects of child care hours. And for the effects related to child care hours, again, you're going to see the gold bar is going to be the 4.5-year findings. Grade 1 is light blue, grade 3 is dark blue. And we're seeing one of the measures of behavior problems is called externalizing, and that's one of acting out behaviors. Could be non-compliance, can also be non-compliance, disobedience, and also some not getting along with other kids, including aggression. So if you look at externalizing, you see that those bars are going down, effect size at about 0.12 initially, and then it's going down at grade 1, grade 3. So one thing you could be wondering as you're looking at those is the effects of early child care, negative effects on externalizing kind of behaviors. Is that effect going to fade away? You'll see that we also were looking at social skills and the effects related to childcare related to social skills. First, you're seeing some higher externalizing, but also some higher social skills related to hours. Those look like those effects may be getting smaller. You can see I'm building the suspense. Yes?
It's a social skills scaled in a negative way. These are social skill problems.
They're also, no, they're actually positive social skills.
So it's a negative kind of effect on externalizing and a positive effect on
Exactly.
social skills.
And one of the things, actually, if you look at kids at 2 and 3, it's one of the things that you often see, that kids who are social do positive stuff and they also do negative stuff with peers. Conflict, in this case, the conflict is conflict with teachers. And you're seeing that one also going down with the highest conflict associated with hours at 4.5, getting down very small by 3, or grade 3. And then we didn't measure work habits when the kids were 4.5, but we did when they were in grade 1 and grade 3 by teacher report. And we see there, those are going down. So the question is going to be, what are we going to see as kids get older? And now here's the last set of findings is center care, where in general the center care results in the earlier analyses for NICHD is that we found centers associated with some positive outcomes, cognitive outcomes, memory, but also associated with some negative outcomes, conflict with teacher, externalizing behaviors as reported by the teacher, and conflict as reported by the mother. Hard to get along with. Now, this slide is going to help us contextualize, think about, we've been putting some effect sizes up on the board. The effects that I was putting on the board were statistically significant. And and if we were to use Cohen's kappa as a judge of the size of those effects, we'd say they were small effects. Another way of thinking about the size of those child care effects is to say, well, how do they compare to other effects? And Robert Rosenthal is a person who helped us to think about the value of comparing. Kathleen McCartney is another, of comparing the effect sizes. And here are the effects that we're going to be comparing. So this is looking at the 54-month child care findings. So over on the far left, you see the quality effects that you had seen previously. Quality related to language, achievement, social skills, and then the next slide is going to be the next portion is going to look hours, where you see when you go below the 0, that's indicating that some of the social overall is negative. That's that externalizing finding. And then you see, I'm sorry, you're right. Greg, I'm thinking you're right. That may be fewer social skills, actually. Because we're going lower on social skills. The behavior problems are inflated with higher hours. You see the center care effect. And then look over the parenting effect. One of the big take-home messages from the NICHD study from the beginning has been the importance of parenting. So if we're going to be looking at the effects associated with language for parenting, much larger effects than what we're getting for child care. If you're looking at effects for achievement, academic achievement, the social effects, the behavior problem effects, the effects of quality of parenting are much larger than the effects associated with child care. Now, when we look at those parenting effects, you have to know that we have included in the parenting, we have the experience with the parents. We also have some genetic effects that are intertwined with those experiential effects. But the larger kind of issue is if we're thinking about effects of child care, if we're thinking about effects of family are considerably larger, about 3 times as large as the effects associated with child care. So as we're thinking about lessons to families, as they may either worry about the risk associated with child care or think about child care as a support for their children, that family is a larger factor. Okay, so to summarize, what we found at younger ages, was some child care effects with higher quality child care predicting better pre-academic skills and language performance, and higher quantity of care, hours of care, predicting more behavior problems of various sorts, and that child care type was predicting better language skills and memory, but also more problem behaviors. Okay, so now we're up to what we're going to talk about today, which is do effects of early child care, quality, hours, type, predict academic achievement and behavioral adjustment at age 15? Are those links between child care and age 15 outcomes, are they mediated by the child's prior functioning? That is, why, if we find some long-term effects, what might account for some of those effects? And are those links moderated by familial risk or child gender? That is, are there some differential effects for kids who are growing up in at-risk circumstances? Are boys and girls differentially affected by child care? Now, there's really 4 possibilities of child care effects at age 15 that could happen. The child care effects of child care that we had seen previously could fade away by age 15. They're not very big. They could fade away. They could carry forward pretty much like what we saw before, small effects that just get carried forward. They could serve as a springboard. Here you were, and because you were doing really well, that's going to bump you up, or you weren't doing so well, so maybe springboard isn't the right way. It could springboard you to more behavior problems. Or you could have some effects that would emerge, sleeper effects. Okay, now before I go to tell you what we found, why don't you think to yourself what you think we're going to have found? Okay. So we did a structural equation models with full information maximum likelihood to test the effects of early child care quality, type, and hours. Because we used FEML, we were able to do analyses based on the full sample, the 1,364 children, although by the time we got to age 15, our sample size was 958. But there's that we were able to take into account. We're also going to the missing data. When significant associations are detected, we're going to be giving you some effect sizes, and effect sizes give you in a standardized way. In those earlier reports that I was giving you, they'll give you a standardized way because different measures have different metrics. The different measures have different standard deviations, so this will give us a common language for looking at these effects. A huge issue in this study, because it's not an experiment, we weren't able to randomly assign children to different levels of quality of care or to different hours or type. A very big worry is selection. Have we, are families who are selecting different types of care, do they differ in ways that would account for these findings? So you're going to see in early childhood we have a variety of covariates that we included in the model. We also had, and those would include gender, ethnicity, family income to needs that we were measuring every 4 months. Family composition, was it a one-parent or two-parent household, again, measured every 4 months. The mother's education, the mother's score on the PPVT, which is a measure of verbal skills, maternal psychological adjustment, maternal depression, parenting quality that we observed at every age that we also observed child care, and classroom quality when the children got to elementary school. So we went in, would spend 2 days in first grade, third grade, and fifth grade. So all of those are controlled for in early childhood, middle childhood, and then you see the measures that we were also controlling for in adolescence. And the adolescent outcomes are the ones, we have many other adolescent outcomes, but paralleling the work that I just described to you, we're going to be looking at cognitive academic achievement, externalizing behaviors, risk, and the externalizing now, we're having the youth report it as opposed to the teacher or the parent. We're having risk-taking that's going from as minor as riding in a car without a seatbelt to doing things with guns. So a variety of risky behaviors. Impulsivity, which are things like when I go to a party, I have a hard time controlling myself. Okay, so here's the results of the structural equation model. And let's start by looking at the relation between hours and we tested to see if hours was what it would be related to, and what you see here is that hours is positively associated with impulsivity. Children who had reported more, or who had been in more hours of care reported greater impulsivity at age 15. Children who had been in greater and more hours of care also self-reported more risk-taking behaviors. If these are path coefficients here that can also be sort of thought about. We're going to give you some of the effect sizes in just a minute, but these effect sizes are roughly the size of what we saw in the earlier ages. We see quality of care predicting a latent variable that was cognitive academic achievement at age 15, and what went into that cognitive academic achievement were the Woodcock-Johnson scores for vocabulary, reading, math skills, and verbal analogies. So children who had higher quality care in early childhood, birth to 4.5, had higher cognitive academic achievement at age 15. That effect, again, is about the same size as what we saw in first, third, and fifth grade. We also found something that we hadn't seen in a long time, and that is that quality of care was predicting externalizing behavior. In this case, higher quality of care was predicting youths reporting less externalizing. Now, when we had looked at the children at 2, which I didn't talk about today, and when we looked at the children at 3, we had also found higher quality care related to less externalizing. But when we had gotten to 4.5, we hadn't seen that relation, and we hadn't seen it for quite a while. But we saw it again at age 15. We're also seeing a relation between a quadratic term for quality related to cognitive academic achievement. I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a second. Let me find it here. Shoot. There it is. So this is what that quadratic looks like. That is that the associations between child care quality and academic achievement, we started seeing some of that positive relation somewhere about an OR score of about 2.7, 2.8, which is about the average score that we were getting, where the care is going from not so good to okay to pretty good. And we see that effect as the care gets of higher quality, we get a larger effect on quality, as opposed to a simple, but we don't get that quality effect in the low range at age 15. Okay, so here are some of those effect sizes that I had mentioned to you. So we're finding at age 15 small but reliable associations between quality of child care for the language academic composite. We're also finding effects of quality related to fewer problem behaviors. We're finding hours of care, of non-relative care, related to more risk-taking and more impulsivity. We didn't find at age 15 effects of center-type care. Those had faded away. So here, I'm going to put back to you the slide I showed you earlier. These were those effects at 54 months, grade 1, grade 3. And you're going to be seeing here that effect of 0.10 at age 15, making the point of comparable size effects. If we're going to be looking at hours effect at age 15, we're coming up with an effect size of 0.08, which is pretty much what we were seeing at grade 1 for many of these effects. So hours related to some impulsivity and risk-taking. Now, another question that we asked was, so what might be the mechanism by which we see these child care effects being maintained from early childhood, elementary school, up to age 15? So we did some separate structural equation models examining the pathway for cognitive academic achievement and the pathway for behavior problems. And what we did for academic achievement was add academic achievement in 54 months, grade 1, grade 3, grade 5, and then what we did for externalizing, we did the same thing. We did separate paths here. So here's the pathway model for prior academic achievement. What you're going to see here is we have that child care quality effect over on the far left at age 54 months. That is then related to academic achievement at 54 months. That gets carried forward to academic achievement in grade 1. That gets carried forward to academic achievement in grade 3, grade 5, and then to age 15. For those of you who are familiar with the terminology mediation, what we have here is a mediation model that earlier achievement begets and contributes into the subsequent achievement. Now, the pathway model for the externalizing behaviors is we see a relation between hours and externalizing at 4.5 to grade 1, grade 3, grade 5, then predicting down to these externalizing and risk-taking behaviors. But you also see here some direct paths that are not mediated by externalizing behavior. And one of the open questions for us is what may be happening there. What other mechanisms may be explaining some of these links between quality and fewer externalizing behaviors at age 15? What might be explaining some of the links between hours and either risk-taking and impulsivity if it doesn't go through externalizing? I'm thinking that it may be related to some behavioral control and inhibition, effortful control, inhibitory control may be a mechanism that we didn't test in this model, but would be an interesting one to look at. Moderation analyses, we looked to see if there were differences in these models for children who were in high-risk versus low-risk family circumstances. One of the arguments that is sometimes made is that poor children, children from low-income families, derive greater benefits from child care or high-quality child care or child care than do children from more affluent families. In our analyses, we have not found any evidence of that. We're finding that the effects of child care that we're finding are comparable across different SES risk groups. And we're also finding no evidence of differential effects for boys or girls. Our message has been pretty much in this study a main effects finding. Now we have some new analyses that were not in the paper that you read for today, but I thought I would just share them with you briefly before I open this up for questions. We have in this study looked a lot for differential effects, particularly differential effects related to parenting. And in some analyses that Peg Birchinall and Jay Belsky and I have recently completed, we're finding some evidence of moderation with later parenting. So that children who, here's what it looks like, running the same interaction terms that we did, or running the same statistical kinds of models that we did in the paper that I just described, we also then added an interaction term that was going to be able to have us look at effects when parenting quality in middle childhood was high quality versus when parenting quality in middle childhood was low quality. And what we're finding in relation to the behavior problems is that at age 15, when children who had been in care for a lot of hours had high quality parenting in middle childhood, that the externalizing behaviors decreased, were lower at age 15, that the impulsivity was low at age 15, that's the blue bar, the risk-taking was low, that the group who was showing high externalizing, high risk-taking, high impulsivity were those who had lots of hours in early childhood and poor quality parenting in middle childhood in relation to outcomes at age 15. Now these are results that are under review right now, so I wouldn't, they're new results. We'll see what happens as they go through the review process. Okay, my conclusions would be that we're finding at age 15 higher quality child care related to both cognitive outcomes and social outcomes, with benefits of higher quality care, particularly as that care goes from medium to high quality. We're finding results that higher hours of care are related to risk-taking and impulsivity. We're finding that some of those effects of early child care are mediated or follow a path of what's happening in elementary school, and that we're finding that parenting in early childhood and middle childhood are larger influences than the effects of early child care. So, questions? Yes, Carol.
What were your quality indicators when you talk about, high, low, medium, child care, and also parenting? Did you have a rubric? How did you decide who was a high quality parent, a low quality parent, or a high quality childhood or child care and low quality?
Okay. So let me take child care first and then we'll talk parenting. For child care, we did observational assessments, 2-day assessments at 6, 15, 24, 36, 54 months. And we had field observers who were trained using field videotapes and also trained using live field observations. So they were all trained to observe care in the same way. And then we looked at this continuum in care, and the kinds of dimensions that we were looking at were sensitivity to the child's social signals, intrusiveness, emotional detachment, that was negatively, that you would reverse code, cognitive stimulation, and engagement with the child. So that's the child care quality measures of the ones we're looking at today. And we also then had these time sample ones that I didn't describe. The parenting measures at 6, 15, 24, 36, and 54 months, and then in first grade, third grade, fifth grade, and age 15, we had observations of parenting that were videotaped. In these analyses, we're looking at mother-child interactions that were videotaped in a semi-structured situation in the lab. And then we also went into the home and did one-day home observations using an instrument called the HOME. So we then put those two scores together and come up with the parenting quality score. For high quality, low quality in these analyses, we used a median split. So half qualified in these analyses as high quality and half qualified as low quality. But when we did the scoring, we did it based on the observations of how, and there the dimensions were similar for parenting to what we were looking at in child care. Sensitivity to the child's cues, support for the child's autonomy, things like that. It's interesting because many people had not found observational measures of parenting to be that predictive way back when, 20 years ago. We're finding these measures of parenting, I think partly because the procedures are really good procedures. I think the codes are good codes. We're finding for many of these kind of outcomes on the order of about a 0.3 to 0.4 effect size for our parenting measures. Yes?
Two questions. Number one would be why not a random sample? And the other one would be why not a more even distribution of sort of race, ethnicity?
Both of those were excellent questions. You have to, I think why not a random sample, you have to probably put your self into the mindset of where we were 20 years ago. The notion of experimental designs for assigning children to childcare or having them stay home or was not, we didn't actually think about it very much, although I'm going to say Allison Clark Stewart, who was the longtime faculty member here at UC Irvine. I remember the second meeting of the steering committee, and that's what she proposed to do. She said, we should do an experimental study, we should randomly assign this, and people in the room laughed because we thought she was joking. She'll tell you that she wasn't joking, but it just didn't. The other thing that we did for the study, we actually did a conditional random sample of the families that were eligible for the study. We were worried about the quality of the measures if some of the sample sizes went too small. So for example, the sample does not include children of adolescent mothers. We were worried about what would happen with these measures that had not been validated on English language learners. Back then, we made some decisions that I think we'd make different decisions now. And so the wise woman in the room on what we should have done with the sample was Betty Caldwell, and who was the person who developed the home instrument. And what Betty argued was that we should take the kids, I just love hearing it, we should have taken those kids when they came down the birth canal. And taken them, whoever was there, and we laughed at that one. It was like, oh, Betty, we can't do that because, we should have. The sample was not drawn also because they funded the priority scores. People were recruiting out of the locations where they were. These very issues, when you're setting up your sampling frame, they came back. They have been a recurrent criticism of the study that it's making you kind of think, we should have thought more about that sampling frame. We should have, but at the time, we didn't have the benefit of the kind of knowledge that the field has. But you hit a good criticism. Yes?
So I was curious to know about the effects, I think you kind of touched on this, of externalizing impulsivity and risk-taking. Because I feel like those should be correlated together, like how you talked about how quality affects it,
Yeah.
one or the other, and there's not really, when you're looking at risk-taking, is it negative risk-taking, positive risk-taking?
The measure
Like
of risk-taking and impulsivity and externalizing, they are correlated, and they were correlated on the order. I'm pulling a number out of my hat without knowing for sure. My recollection is about 0.5. In the structural equation model, we tried to create a latent variable that was going to be for the risk-taking, analogous to the cognitive one we did, and the darn model wouldn't hold together. So we had to do them as manifest variables. We wanted it to be a latent variable, and they are correlated.
But you said that the hours, higher hours predicted more risk-taking, but then the quality did less externalizing.
Okay, the quality of care predicted less externalizing, and the hours relation to externalizing by youth report was, the p-value was 0.052. TAG just won't let that point, it's like it doesn't exist. I'm kind of going, it's kind of close. But it was, it's not like it dropped out completely, but it didn't hit the standard that it needed to.
Right, yeah.
Joe?
It was interesting for me to learn that this was originally framed as a public health issue, and I didn't know that. So that might explain why many of the outcomes you looked at could be framed in the negative. But in between the time the study was designed and today, there's been a growing interest in positive youth development. And I was wondering if you might try to connect these to any of those kinds of indicators, psychological, emotional well-being, initiative, positive social skills, peer relations, things like that.
The data set has, at each of the ages, those very measures that you're talking about, particularly the age 15 data set and now the age 18 data set have a lot of the kind of measures of positive youth development, initiative kinds of things are in there. I think that the original framing of the study around attachment, and when we did this, the age 4.5 paper, we called it the omnibus paper, and we were going to look at effects of hours, quality, and center care in one place, and we wanted to have our cognitive outcomes that the debates were that we were going to get these cognitive benefits, and we were going to put the behavior problems that Jay in some of his earlier work had thought would be the areas for the behavior problems. What we did not include in that paper were these other kind of outcomes. There are other papers that are focusing on the quality of peer relationships, and other papers that are looking. There's also, because of it being framed as a public health issue, we have measures of body mass index and various kinds of illnesses, gastrointestinal and ear infections, and those kind of things are in this data set as well. Yes?
The moderation model, particularly with the risk factors and quality of care, was that done at other years as
Yes.
well? And that wasn't predictive at any time of any outcomes?
Right. Yeah. You know, many of the investigators, myself included, were very influenced by Bronfenbrenner. And the idea of moderated relations and interaction terms, we just believe that they have to be there. And so we have really looked for them pretty hard. There could be some reasons that we might not be finding them related to how large the sample might be in some of the subgroups and things. And there are some other people who have started to use the data set or that are beginning to find some moderated relations. But we routinely look at interactions between parenting quality, and we didn't find quality of parenting in early childhood moderating the effects of child care. The sequential one, though, is sort of interesting as you think about effects over time. Greg.
You're lumping together cognitive and academic, and if you look at the model programs for very high quality child care kind of settings, early education settings, you tend to get a short-term effect on cognitive ability, and in some of them a longer-term impact on achievement, right? Which might be what you expect if cognitive ability has more of a genetic component, the achievement really doesn't. Did you try separating those two to see if these age 15 effects of child care persisted more for the academic side of that?
That's a great question, because at the earlier ages, for example, the 54-month, we looked at the cognitive and academic achievement measures separately. And in this one, we didn't, because of it coming up with this latent variable. I think a great follow-up analysis would be to try to unpack it. I think what may also be happening in these higher quality programs, a big part of what you see in quality is that the caregivers are talking to the kids, and that talking to the kids is related to vocabulary. And vocabulary is one of those areas that looks like it's particularly important in terms of some carrying forward. You know, it's easier to teach things like letter-word identification, and then you get to about 3rd grade, and that letter-word identification doesn't do good predicting. But vocabulary looks like the vocabulary and the applied problems, the math indicators, are two that I think would be really good to look at. And then on the cognition side, some of the memory ones. And then we have some. We're going to look in our doctoral seminar. We're going to be looking at some of these inhibitory control kinds of measures and attention, and I think those have some legs. Guys, I want to thank you for coming and hearing a bit about the study. I'll be pleased to answer questions afterwards too.